Claire Mitchell thought she was just chasing a thrill, and Jacob Grant believed he was falling in love. But when Michael Mitchell found out, one secret affair spiraled into a calculated murder that shocked an entire town. Claire Mitchell had always been seen as the image of grace in the quiet suburban town of Willow Creek. At 42, she lived what many called an ideal life. Married to Michael, her high school sweetheart, with 2 teenage children and a well-kept home nestled between manicured lawns and white picket fences. Her days were filled with PTA meetings, garden clubs, and grocery runs. From the outside, it was a postcard-perfect life. But for Claire, something was missing. The predictability of her routine had dulled her spirit, and the emotional distance that had grown between her and Michael made the silence in their home almost unbearable. He worked long hours as a contractor, often leaving early and returning late, always too tired to talk. The once spontaneous affection between them had long turned into polite exchanges and carefully coordinated schedules. Claire didn't know exactly when she started feeling invisible in her own life, but by the summer of that year, the feeling had grown roots. It was around this time that Jacob Grant returned home from college for the summer. At 19, Jacob was tall, lean, and had the confident charm of someone just beginning to understand the power of his own presence. He was the son of the Mitchell's neighbors, David and Lynn Grant, and had grown up playing in the same cul-de-sac as Claire's children. Claire had watched Jacob grow up, but when she saw him again that June, something shifted. He was no longer the awkward teenager she remembered. He had changed, and it stirred something inside her that she hadn't felt in years. It began innocently. A short conversation near the mailbox, a smile exchanged across the driveway, then longer talks while walking their dogs, timed conveniently when both knew the other would be outside. Jacob, home for the summer with little to do, welcomed the attention. Claire, trapped in the repetition of her domestic life, found herself drawn to his energy. It wasn't long before their exchanges turned flirtatious, each one a quiet rebellion against the lives they were supposed to live. What began as harmless curiosity soon spiraled into something much deeper and much more dangerous. They started meeting during the day when Jacob's parents were at work, sometimes in the park, sometimes at his house, always careful, always quiet. The thrill of secrecy added fuel to the fire. Claire felt alive again in a way she hadn't in years. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. Jacob, young and impulsive, mistook Claire's attention for love. He became possessive, obsessed even, texting her constantly and talking about a future they could never have. Claire dismissed it at first as youthful fantasy, but the intensity grew. He began showing up at her home uninvited, waiting outside in his car, watching her from across the street. She tried to cool things down, but each attempt only made him cling harder. Then, something Claire never anticipated happened. Her daughter, Ava, came home early from school one afternoon. Claire had been at Jacob's house. Ava walked in through the back door and saw something she didn't fully understand: her mother and Jacob together. Shocked and confused, Ava left without saying anything, but the image stayed burned in her mind. Later that night, she told her older brother, Tyler. Tyler, in turn, told their father. Michael didn't react immediately. Instead, he became quiet and withdrawn, watching Claire closely over the next few days. She noticed the change but assumed he was simply preoccupied with work. He said nothing, but something had shifted. Michael began leaving the house at unusual times, sometimes returning late, sometimes not at all. Claire, distracted by her own guilt and the growing pressure from Jacob, didn't question him. She had no idea that Michael was already putting the pieces together. Unable to shake his suspicions, Michael hired a private investigator. Within a week, the truth was in front of him in black and white. Photos of Claire and Jacob together, embracing in his car, walking hand in hand through a secluded park. The evidence was undeniable. Michael was devastated, humiliated, and enraged. But instead of confronting Claire, he chose a different path. He would wait, watch, and plan. He told no one, not even the children, what he had found. He went about life as though nothing had changed. What Michael planned to do next would take the quiet tragedy of a broken marriage and turn it into a story that would haunt Willow Creek forever. The days following Jacob's disappearance were filled with confusion, silence, and quiet tension that seemed to linger in every corner of the neighborhood. Jacob's parents, David and Lynn Grant, initially assumed he had gone on one of his spontaneous camping trips. He had done it before, leaving without much notice, turning off his phone, and returning days later with vague stories about needing time alone. But when he missed his part-time shift at the local auto shop and didn't respond to any messages, concern turned into fear. By the third day, they contacted the police and officially filed a missing persons report. Flyers with Jacob's face appeared on every streetlight pole, gas station window, and community bulletin board in Willow Creek. Meanwhile, Claire was barely holding herself together. The news of Jacob's disappearance hit her like a bolt of lightning. She hadn't heard from him since their last meeting in the garage behind his house, the meeting where she had tried to end things once and for all. Jacob had become increasingly erratic and demanding, sending her text after text, some loving, some threatening. He had begun speaking as if she owed him something, as if their relationship was the only truth in her life. But Claire had realized how far it had all gone. The secrecy, the danger, the damage it was doing to her family, it had to stop. That night in the garage, she told him firmly that it was over. He had begged, pleaded, then turned angry, but she stood her ground and left. She hadn't heard from him since. Claire didn't know whether to feel relieved or worried. Part of her feared that Jacob had done something reckless, maybe even to himself. But another part feared something even worse. Someone else might have found out. She thought about Michael often, about his cold distance, the way he had started to stare through her instead of at her. There was something unreadable in his eyes lately, something that made her skin crawl. Still, she said nothing. The police began canvassing the neighborhood, going door to door, asking questions. When they reached the Mitchells' home, Claire was composed, answering questions about Jacob with forced casualness. She told them she hadn't seen him in weeks. But detectives are trained to read beneath the surface, and Claire's performance didn't go unnoticed. Her body language was tense, her answers short. They asked to see her phone. She hesitated. Eventually, under pressure, Claire admitted to having a relationship with Jacob. She framed it as a brief and regrettable mistake, something she had ended weeks ago. She insisted she had nothing to do with his disappearance. The detectives listened but didn't believe everything she said. They requested access to her text messages and call history. What they found added another layer to the mystery. The last text Jacob had sent, timestamped just hours before he vanished, read, "If you're not going to tell them, I will." That message sent alarm bells ringing. The police began treating the case not just as a disappearance, but as a potential crime. A search warrant was issued for the Grant family garage, the last known place Jacob had been seen by Claire. Inside, the place looked ordinary at first, but forensic teams found something alarming. A small, dried pool of blood near the corner, partially obscured by storage boxes. The DNA was later confirmed to be Jacob's. They also recovered a broken smartphone wedged behind a set of old shelves. The screen was shattered, but parts of the message history were still retrievable. One name kept appearing again and again: Claire Mitchell. With mounting evidence, Claire was brought in for further questioning. This time, she was not calm. She was pale, visibly shaking, and unable to maintain the lies she had prepared. She repeated that she had tried to end things with Jacob, that he had become unstable, that she feared he might harm himself or her. But the detectives weren't convinced. Claire's story was unraveling. She couldn't explain the blood. She couldn't explain the broken phone or why she hadn't come forward sooner. The search expanded beyond the garage. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search the surrounding area. Neighbors watched in disbelief as officers dug up parts of the Grants' backyard. Tension spread through the community like wildfire. Everyone had questions, but no one had answers. Then came the discovery. Under a thick patch of disturbed soil near the base of an old oak tree, detectives uncovered a shallow grave. Wrapped in a tarp, the body was badly decomposed but still identifiable. It was Jacob. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear, but there were signs of blunt force trauma to the back of the head. The community that once celebrated quiet perfection was now the center of a gruesome investigation. And Claire was at the center of it all. The entire town of Willow Creek seemed to come to a halt after Jacob Grant's body was discovered. The local news station set up camp just outside the neighborhood entrance. Neighbors who had once gossiped about school events and lawn care now whispered in hushed tones about murder, betrayal, and the woman at the center of it all, Claire Mitchell. She had gone from the friendly housewife who always brought the best cookies to bake sales to the lead suspect in a homicide investigation. Her face was plastered across headlines and social media feeds, her life now dissected by strangers and analysts. But beneath the surface of public opinion, the police were still trying to untangle what had really happened the night Jacob died. The autopsy revealed a grim truth. Jacob had suffered a single, fatal blow to the back of his head from a heavy object, followed by signs that he had been moved post-mortem. Investigators returned to the Grants' garage, this time with a sharper eye. Hidden behind insulation in the wall, they found a pair of gloves stained with blood and a muddy shovel. DNA testing confirmed Jacob's blood on the gloves and traces of both Jacob's and Claire's fingerprints on the shovel's handle. The garage had become a stage for something sinister, but there were still pieces missing. Claire remained in police custody during the investigation. Her story had changed again. She now admitted that the final meeting with Jacob had turned physical, that he had grabbed her, refused to let her leave, and shouted threats. She claimed she pushed him away and ran. She insisted he was alive when she left the garage and that she didn't know what happened after. Her lawyers painted her as a scared woman caught in a moment of panic, overwhelmed by an obsessive young man and her own collapsing world. But the evidence told a different story. The broken phone found in the garage had more to reveal. A forensic team recovered fragments of audio and video files, one of which included Jacob's voice, recorded unknowingly by the phone's voice memo function. The short clip captured Jacob arguing with someone, but the voice that responded wasn't Claire's. It was deeper, firmer, and unmistakably male. Detectives played the audio for Claire during another round of questioning. Her reaction was immediate: shock, confusion, and then fear. She recognized the voice. It was Michael. The revelation sent the investigation in a new direction. Up until now, Michael Mitchell had been relatively untouched by the case. He had given brief statements, expressed concern, and kept a low profile. But now, investigators turned their attention toward him. A warrant was issued to search the Mitchells' home. In the tool shed behind the house, buried under a pile of old tarps and containers, officers found a heavy steel wrench. It was rusted and dirty, but a quick field test revealed what they feared: traces of blood. Lab analysis later confirmed it was Jacob's. Michael was brought in for questioning, and what followed stunned even the most seasoned detectives. At first, he denied everything. He claimed the wrench hadn't been touched in months, that he hadn't been near the Grants' garage that night, that he had been working late and had proof. But when shown the video clip and presented with the DNA evidence, Michael's demeanor cracked. Under the weight of the truth, he confessed. Michael admitted that he had followed Claire the night she went to end things with Jacob. He parked a few blocks away, walked through the back alley, and watched from a small window as Claire confronted the boy. He had seen the desperation in Jacob's eyes, the way he grabbed her arm, the way she pulled away. Michael had waited until she left, then entered the garage. The confrontation that followed was short and violent. Michael struck Jacob with the wrench and then, in a panic, buried the body. But what shocked investigators most wasn't just the murder, it was the motive behind the cover-up. Michael hadn't just killed Jacob in a rage. He had planted evidence, forged texts using a spoofing app, and moved Jacob's phone to suggest continued contact with Claire. His goal was to frame her. In his words, she had destroyed his pride, his family, and his name, so he would destroy hers. He wanted her to suffer publicly, to be judged, to be humiliated in the same way he felt humiliated by her betrayal. Claire was released the next day. The charges against her were dropped, but her name remained tarnished. The media had already convicted her in the court of public opinion. Though no longer facing prison, she returned home to find her life in ruins. Her children, once close and trusting, barely spoke to her. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Her marriage, her family, her image, everything was gone to A.S. Michael sat in a jail cell awaiting trial. The town of Willow Creek began to grapple with the reality that the real crime was not just the murder of a young man, but the quiet cruelty that had grown. Behind closed doors for years, the courtroom was packed the day Michael Mitchell's trial began. Reporters filled the gallery, sketch artists hunched over their pads, and dozens of curious locals who had once called him a friend now watched him with a mix of shock and disbelief. The man who had been known as a reliable contractor, a family man, and a community volunteer was now facing a first-degree murder charge. The prosecution painted him as a man who had been consumed by pride and rage, someone who couldn't accept the betrayal of his wife and chose to exact the ultimate revenge, not only on the young man involved, but on Claire herself. Their theory was simple. Michael had planned everything after discovering the affair and used the opportunity to frame Claire for murder. In his confession, Michael claimed the killing was spontaneous, a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment. But evidence told a different story. Surveillance footage showed him purchasing heavy-duty gloves and a new shovel a week before Jacob's death. Records from his computer revealed that he had visited websites detailing how to spoof text messages and erase phone data. The state argued that this wasn't a sudden outburst, but a cold, calculated murder designed not only to eliminate Jacob but to ruin Claire's life. Claire took the stand during the second week of the trial. She walked into the courtroom with trembling hands and tired eyes, her once carefully composed image now replaced with raw vulnerability. She spoke clearly, recounting her relationship with Jacob, the secrecy, the regret, and how it all led to that final meeting in the garage. When asked about her marriage to Michael, she described a relationship that had long lost warmth, one held together only by habit and social expectation. She never imagined he was capable of murder, let alone framing her for it. Michael sat stone-faced. As she testified, never looking at her directly. His defense attorney tried to portray him as a broken man pushed to the edge, a victim of betrayal who lost control. But with every piece of digital evidence and each witness statement, that image began to crumble. The jury heard how Michael had accessed Jacob's social media accounts after his death, sending messages to Claire in an effort to make it appear Jacob was still alive. They listened to audio from the garage, Jacob pleading, then a sharp crack. In silence, they saw photos of the wrench, the gloves, the grave. The most damning testimony came from Michael's former co-worker, who admitted under oath that Michael had asked hypothetical questions about hiding a body just days before Jacob went missing. The courtroom went silent when that statement was read aloud. The prosecutor looked at the jury and said there was nothing hypothetical about what Michael had done. Michael never showed emotion during the trial. He declined to take the stand in his own defense. His lawyer argued that Michael had suffered a mental breakdown, a sudden psychological collapse brought on by betrayal, humiliation, and suppressed rage. But the jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, evidence tampering, and attempted framing. Michael was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, during sentencing, stated that the murder was not only an act of violence, but an elaborate attempt to manipulate justice and destroy the life of an innocent woman. He called Michael's actions as cruel as they were calculated. The aftermath was painful for everyone involved. Jacob's parents sobbed quietly during the sentencing, clutching a framed photo of their son. They said they would never forgive Michael for what he had done, and they didn't know if they could forgive Claire either. Claire's children were caught in a storm they never asked for, forced to reevaluate everything they thought they knew about their parents. Tyler, her son, moved out of the house months after the trial, refusing to live in a place where so many secrets had been buried. Ava, younger and still processing the trauma, stopped speaking at school and began therapy. Claire was left to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by poor decisions and unimaginable consequences. Her reputation was beyond repair, even though she was legally innocent. The whispers followed her wherever she went, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even walking down the street. She sold the house and moved to a smaller town under a different name, hoping for some form of anonymity, but memories don't fade with a change of address. The choices that brought her to that point followed her like a shadow. Her affair, Michael's crime, Jacob's death, none of it could be undone. Claire knew she would carry the weight of it forever. Years passed, but the echoes of what happened in Willow Creek never truly faded. The story of Jacob Grant's murder had once dominated headlines and evening news reports. It became the subject of podcasts, internet sleuth forums, and even a cable documentary series. Yet, for those closest to the tragedy, no broadcast could capture the full weight of what had been lost. In the quiet spaces beyond the media frenzy, the survivors of the story, Claire Mitchell, Jacob's grieving parents, and two shattered children, were left to navigate the ruins of their lives. Claire had relocated shortly after Michael's sentencing. With her name now forever tied to the scandal, she had no real choice but to disappear. She moved to a small coastal town 3 states away under her maiden name, renting a modest one-bedroom apartment and taking a job as a clerk in a bookstore. The woman who had once hosted garden parties and managed household schedules now lived in near total isolation. She avoided neighbors, rarely spoke more than necessary, and never revealed anything about her past. The bookstore was quiet and uneventful, just the way she wanted it. Yet even in her anonymity, the weight of her choices lingered. She spent many nights replaying the events that had led to Jacob's death. The affair she thought was a harmless escape had unraveled into a nightmare no one could have predicted. She didn't just mourn the young man who had died. She mourned her former self, the life she had destroyed, and the children who now barely acknowledged her existence. Letters sent to Tyler and Ava went unanswered. Holidays passed in silence. The few times she tried to call, she was met with voicemails that never returned her messages. She understood. Their silence was her punishment that Jacob's parents never moved back into their home after the trial. The yard, once meticulously maintained by David, grew wild and overgrown. The Grants left Willow Creek entirely, settling near their extended family in Ohio. There, they worked through their grief the only way they knew how, by turning inward. Lynn Grant became an advocate for young adult mental health, sharing Jacob's story at college campuses and therapy conferences. David, though quieter, volunteered with a youth outreach program. They had lost their son in the most senseless way imaginable, but they were determined not to let his death be forgotten. They refused to let Jacob become just another name on a list of victims. Back in Willow Creek, the community eventually returned to a new kind of normal. The Mitchells' house was sold, renovated, and purchased by a family unaware of the grim history embedded in its walls. Neighbors moved on, some never speaking of what happened again, while others couldn't help but recall it every time they passed the old Grant property. The silence that once defined the neighborhood had returned, but it carried a different weight now. It was no longer peaceful, it was haunted. Michael Mitchell, locked away in a maximum security prison, remained mostly silent during his incarceration. He never sought an appeal, never granted an interview, and never wrote a letter to his children. Other inmates called him the contractor after reading about his case. He kept to himself, reportedly spending most of his time in the prison library. There were rumors that he had taken up woodworking as part of a rehabilitation program. But beyond that, no one on the outside heard much from him. His children never visited. Claire never sent a letter. The man who had once orchestrated an elaborate plan to ruin someone else's life now lived a life stripped of everything, including the attention he once craved. Ava, now in college, slowly began to rebuild her life. She changed her last name and focused on psychology, perhaps in an effort to understand the chaos of her teenage years. Tyler took longer to recover. Angry, resentful, and confused, he struggled with relationships and trust. But eventually, through years of therapy and distance, he began to separate himself from the past, not forget it, but no longer let it control him. Neither of the Mitchell children ever spoke publicly about their parents. They simply moved on as best they could, building lives that no longer needed to reference what had once happened in that seemingly perfect neighborhood. The tragedy in Willow Creek became a cautionary tale, a reminder that beneath the facade of normalcy, lives can fracture, and hidden passions can ignite consequences beyond imagination. Claire's affair was never just an escape. It was a decision that triggered a domino effect of obsession, rage, and irreversible loss. In the end, no one had truly escaped unscathed. Not the victim, not the perpetrator, not the bystanders caught in the emotional crossfire. The murder was solved, the killer imprisoned, and the case closed. But the story, in all its complexity, lived on, in whispers, in scars, and in the quiet spaces left behind by the people who never came home.